Trump's Project 2025 and the Legacy of Human Trafficking in America. As the United States prepares for its 2024 presidential election, one policy framework that's been gaining attention is Project 2025, a conservative plan spearheaded by several think tanks and Trump-aligned groups, aimed at reshaping American governance. While Project 2025 emphasizes a reorganization of federal power, reducing bureaucracy, and shifting policy to align with far-right ideology, it also reflects deeper ideological undercurrents about control, power, and inequality that can be traced back to America's dark history of enslavement and oppression. Understanding Project 2025. Project 2025, proposed by the Heritage Foundation and other conservative organizations, outlines a roadmap for the future of American governance should Donald Trump, or a similar far-right candidate, regain the presidency in 2025. It's a political strategy focused on streamlining federal agencies, dismantling regulatory structures, and fortifying executive power, with many seeing it as a way to solidify right-wing dominance over the federal government. Proponents argue it would restore American democracy by curbing what they see as the overreach of progressive policies and reinvigorating conservative principles. Yet, critics argue that such centralization of power, and the weakening of federal agencies responsible for enforcing civil rights, environmental protections, and social welfare, could disproportionately harm marginalized communities, especially Black Americans, people of color, and the working poor. It brings forward unsettling echoes of historical systems of domination and exploitation. The legacy of human trafficking and chattel slavery. To fully grasp the implications of Project 2025, we must confront the legacy of America's original sin, the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of Africans. From the 16th to the 19th century, millions of Africans were forcibly trafficked to the Americas, including the United States, where they endured brutal conditions and dehumanization. This human trafficking was not just a social or moral failure, it was an economic system designed to enrich the ruling classes and establish a racial caste hierarchy that persists in many forms today. Over 400 years of chattel slavery in the United States, a system of racialized slavery where Africans and their descendants were treated as property, left a deep scar on the nation's collective psyche. The economic, social, and political ramifications of this system are still visible today in the form of racial inequality, mass incarceration, voter suppression, and systemic poverty within African American communities. Slavery was not only a system of forced labor but a method of social control, where the subjugation of black bodies was legally sanctioned, and white supremacy became ingrained in the structures of power. Even after the official abolition of slavery in 1865, the emergence of Jim Crow laws, sharecropping, and later mass incarceration ensured that forms of economic and racial bondage persisted under new guises. This historical context is crucial in understanding how power is wielded in the U.S. and how attempts to centralize authority, like in Project 2025, might recreate conditions reminiscent of those oppressive systems. Correlation between historical human trafficking and potential contemporary exploitation. While Project 2025 is not directly tied to human trafficking in the traditional sense, it raises concerns about the reemergence of systemic oppression. The project's focus on weakening labor rights, curbing civil rights enforcement, and centralizing federal power in the executive branch could lead to policies that exacerbate inequality and subjugation, especially for communities that have historically been disenfranchised. The growing emphasis on reducing federal oversight in areas such as civil rights enforcement and workers' protections might lead to situations where vulnerable populations are exploited under the guise of deregulation or economic freedom. The threat posed by Project 2025 is not one of outright slavery but one of economic, political, and legal structures that disproportionately disenfranchise people of color and the working class. In this sense, it echoes the mechanisms of control that chattel slavery represented. By undermining labor protections, civil rights, and access to legal recourse, Project 2025 could create a modern form of bondage, a system in which individuals and communities are trapped in cycles of poverty, disempowerment, and limited freedom under a facade of personal liberty. Additionally, the project's underlying nationalist and populist rhetoric mirrors the ideological justifications for slavery. Then, as now, there was an appeal to traditional values, a return to greatness, and a defense of a particular hierarchical social order. In this context, the glorification of past systems of control and exclusion can be dangerous, paving the way for policies that infringe on civil liberties and perpetuate inequalities rooted in America's history of human trafficking and enslavement. Conclusion. Project 2025 represents a radical restructuring of American governance, but its potential effects must be understood within the context of historical systems of oppression. The United States has a long history of subjugating vulnerable populations, most notably through the transatlantic slave trade and the institution of chattel slavery. While the explicit enslavement of African people is a thing of the past, the conditions that allowed such systems to flourish, unchecked power, exploitation, and inequality, are still present. If Project 2025 materializes, it could reinforce systems that disproportionately harm marginalized communities, particularly Black Americans. By undermining labor rights, civil rights, and federal oversight, the project risks creating a society where economic exploitation and systemic inequality thrive under a new banner. The shadows of the past, 400 years of enslavement, loom large over America's future. Understanding the potential implications of modern policies like Project 2025 through the lens of history is essential if we are to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.